Steam is full of titles that come and go, and no genre encapsulates this more perfectly than medieval games. It is such a tumultuous time period, almost beautifully coinciding with how it actually was back in the day. People lived and died at the drop of a hat. Games come and go because, well, mostly because they launch into early access. However, I'm going to be going over some of the worst disasters in medieval gaming history. Oh god, it gets worse and worse as we go along. The Stronghold series of games, well, had a stronghold on RTSs the world over, especially when the second one came out and its first foray into 3D titles. This RTS was a masterpiece, and still to this day, especially in 2023, this game has the hearts of many an RTS gamer the world over. Yet there was one entry that didn't quite go down as well as the others. Stronghold 3 was a part of this franchise known for its blend of real-time strategy and castle building simulation, set of course in the medieval time. Because of the success of Stronghold 1 and later 2, not to mention Stronghold Crusader, fans eagerly awaited a true sequel that would enhance and expand upon the original concepts. So Stronghold 3 came about, aiming to be said sequel, with Firefly Studios, the developers, once again at the helm. They'd proven that they knew what this series was. They'd proven that they could capture the hearts of many, so it was going to be a hit, surely. There'd be a new 3D graphics engine, enhanced physics for realistic destruction, day-night cycles that would affect your gameplay and how it would all pan out. With improved AI and pathfinding, there'll be a more dynamic campaign with more mature storylines continuing from the first games. Stronghold 3 kept a lot of the core elements with castle construction and resource management. There was siege warfare and introducing a few new mechanics as well, like freeform building. Unlike the grid-based systems of previous titles, Stronghold 3 allowed for a more flexible placement of structures, and this came into fruition with the realistic physics. Of course, crumbling realistically under siege weaponry. Players once again needed to gather resources like wood, stone and food to build and maintain their castles, and their popularity between the peasants. This happiness of the peasants affected the productivity and tax income, requiring careful balancing. All of this combined with its all-military side, having a range of medieval units like archers, knights, and siege warfare that was now enhanced with the detailed siege equipment and destructive terrain, which is a little bit of a nicer touch. It had single-player campaigns with 2 separate campaigns, continuing the stories from the original title with a multiplayer as well. So, all this kind of lines it up to be the next behemoth of an RTS title, since Stronghold Crusader was so well loved, and of course the originals also had their place as well. But upon release, Stronghold 3 was met with largely negative reviews, and to this day has kind of been ignored. In fact, researching for this video, there's very little about Stronghold 3. People have kind of pretended it doesn't exist. Mostly this was just down to its technical problems. It included so many crashes, AI pathfinding errors, that AI that was supposedly improved, with a ton of graphical glitches. Not just that, but it seemed that they really put a focus on trying to improve the graphics, but with an expense of the actual gameplay. You see, people really wanted them to have a better title, not just a better looking title. It's so full of bugs, even more than Stronghold 2, especially with this troop movement and AI. Not just this though, but they took out a lot of mechanics that made Stronghold 2 fun. It left out every new unit from Stronghold 2 as well, which is an insane decision, but because of its release as a full main title, people were wondering why it was missing some of the many selling points before. The freeform building, some people did enjoy it, but actually it led to difficulties in constructing functional and aesthetically pleasing castles, ironically since their focus was on aesthetics now. Both the enemy and ally AI were criticism for being incredibly irresponsive. For example, people criticized the fact that archers just couldn't shoot anybody if you don't specifically select them to target an individual unit themselves. The AI just wouldn't sort itself out, which for an RTS game where you're trying to do macro managing isn't ideal. The storyline was considered bland and unengaging narratives with a lack of content overall. Stronghold 3 offered fewer maps and variety in gameplay, despite it being the third in a series that had been so popular that Firefly Studios should be working on the hype, using this motivation to get them to a bigger place within the RTS genre, with other titles like Age of Empires and Total War really making their place in the time of the Stronghold 3 release, which was 2011. This should have been a no-brainer, but they just didn't do it. So what were the factors that contributed to Stronghold 3's failing? Well,
Deadlines over quantity. Well, it was speculated that the game was released to meet publishers' deadlines. You see, this comes with successes of franchises that often people, and specifically investors, need titles to be out in certain amounts of time, which means sacrificing necessary development time for polishing and bug fixing. You see, if a game releases with a lot of bugs, this can indicate it to be a rushed title. With delayed patches and of course poor launch support and a lack of communication from the developers, it left the community feeling incredibly neglected. And all of this meant that Firefly were kind of in the mud, and they went away for quite some time until fairly recently with the definitive editions. There was a loss of trust. The game's poor quality damaged the studio's reputation amongst fans and within the industry. And it really showed how you can make a huge franchise and make such a blunder that, well, people only look at the nostalgia of what came before, rather than excitement for what's next. Do you remember War of the Roses? That game that was set during the historical conflict known as Yorkshire is best. Okay, as a Yorkshire guy, I will always know which side that I shall support. But the game offered to immerse players in this tumultuous period, an incredibly bloody war that really doesn't get that much representation, especially in gaming. I mean, I can't really think another title that's really blasted out into the mainstream, and, well, as we're about to work out, War of the Roses tried, but somewhat failed. Okay, it hugely failed. But it was developed by Fat Shark. You know, the guys that made Vermintide and later Darktide? A huge company now. They started doing this sort of thing. Fat Shark intended to create a realistic melee combat system that captured the brutality and skill required in medieval warfare, with extensive options for customization, weapons, and of course perks to suit different playstyles. It was admittedly a 64-player multiplayer-only game at the time, with other, I guess, tutorial parts to it. But the combat system was really cool. It was so heavily inspired by Mount and Blade, however. It's basically Warband's combat system with the 4 directions, just a little bit more clunky. And whilst this realistic combat mechanic was great, they didn't quite nail it, and it didn't quite capture the same attention that a Mount and Blade did, especially releasing at a very, very similar time. Whether you were using your bows, your swords, your axes, or do you remember riding on horseback and being able to lance people? This game had some brutal executions as well. When you got someone down on the floor, you could stab them in the face. Of course, playing as an archer was incredibly satisfying in this title. I played this game when it first came out, and look, I might have only been a little 12-year-old boy, but I still loved it. It was fantastic, despite its flaws. The directional combat was decent enough. The range combat was very fun, especially when you used crossbows as well, and different armor types affected your mobility and protection. I remember it had a lot of emphasis on being a big hulking suit of armor walking around the battlefield, or being able to be a bit more slick and go in that direction as well. There was so much customization, and it was so bright and vibrant for a medieval world that is just not represented, and even when it is, it looks so grey and dull. It was so fresh to have something that felt like real medieval worlds, where people painted colors on their weapons and shield, had bright plumes, and you were able to completely customize these loadouts and have these perk systems, earning an in-game currency to unlock new equipment and custom options as well. The game offered a couple of different game modes, with 2 teams competing in a team deathmatch mode, Conquest, where you could fight for strategic points on the map, and Pitched Battles, the mode with no respawns. If anyone's played Mount and Blade, that's your battle mode where you get 1 life and you basically just go until last man standing. The battlefields were inspired by real locations, whether it was going through fields or fighting through towns or even in small pitched arenas. There was also some sort of siege modes as well, whilst they weren't huge scales. For the time, 64 players was more than enough. But this terrain also had features that would affect your movement and strategy, like forests and rivers that would affect archers, or being able to change the elevation as well, which would mean cavalry could be useless in some areas. So when it came out, how was it received? Well, I think it was very mixed. People loved the fact that there was another studio delving into the medieval world, but it just didn't quite have the polish that I think it needed. The combat system was lauded for its depth and skill required to excel, yet its clunkiness. Whilst it had that ability to easy to learn but difficult to master style that Mount and Blade had, it just wasn't quite as smooth. People loved the extensive customizations, and visually, it looked great, and the sound design contributed to this really immersive medieval atmosphere, definitely going towards the more brutal, bloody side than something like a Mount and Blade did. Yet there are a few factors that inevitably led to its failure. It had some pretty intimidating mechanics for new players, at least in the mainstream. The realistic combat system, whilst it was innovative, was not sufficiently tutorialized, making it harder for new players to enjoy the game. This meant that you have your Mordhouse syndrome, as I like to call it. As the game goes on, you have players that get better and better. People that are, let's admit it, medieval nerds like us who love these types of sword fighting titles, but get good at the game to the point where any new players get absolutely slaughtered, meaning that no person could come in and actually enjoy the title, completely knocking accessibility through the window, and of course making it just a haven for sweats. This is great if you enjoy sword fighting titles, but it's not good for growing a brand. The servers were very unstable as well, with frequent disconnects and lag hampering the multiplayer experience with your general bugs and glitches. You see, Fat Shark was still a fairly new company at this time, and this was one of their newer releases, and they hadn't quite captured what they really were going for. The game was later put to free-to-play, but even that wasn't enough to save it, with titles like Chivalry Medieval Warfare really blowing up at the time, and as I mentioned, the Mount and Blade series that had an established multiplayer and a fan base that came with it. Not just this, but it has single player as well, which I think really captured people's attention and all in all gave it a better variety for the content. So whilst it was a great idea, it wasn't quite executed well, and it released at a really tricky time that, funnily enough, and it sounds almost ironic now because of the lack of medieval titles that we get, but at a time where there was an oversaturation of medieval games. In February of 2017, as I mentioned, Paradox Interactive announced the closure of the official servers after it went free, and, well, nothing really actually happened with the Savior. This was alongside War of the Vikings, which, as a side note, was kind of the sequel to War of the Roses. It came out in about 2015, and it did about the same. It had all the same issues, and they didn't really learn anything from the first failure. So unfortunately, whilst there was another cool game, it didn't quite work. And in fact, as somebody that loved these titles, I'm so sad they didn't work out. I would love to have a proper War of the Roses game, and maybe Fat Shark. Now you got a bit more cash in the bank, you've had your Vermintide and your Darktide successes. Maybe it's time to revisit War of the Roses. War of the Roses 2, War of the Roses Remastered. I think they know what they're doing now, and I would love, just love, to see that come back just one more time.
Let's talk about Reign of Kings. It was going to come up at some point or another. Codehatch was a Canadian indie developer. In fact, actually, I do think they still exist in some form or another. They previously worked on a game called Starforge, which was a science fiction sandbox released in early access on Steam. Yet, when the game came out, it faced a lot of criticism for technical issues and unfulfilled promises, which, I mean, as you probably already know, foreshadowed a lot of the challenges that this game came about. Releasing on March the 11th of 2015, once again Reign of Kings came into early access. It was conceived as a medieval survival game that combined elements of crafting, building, combat, and most importantly, social interaction, i.e. getting people by the legs with rope and then dragging them across the grass. In this medieval setting, it was, I guess, more fantasy than anything. It wasn't exactly dark and gritty, I'm going to be completely honest. Although it did try and make players experience this harsh and realistic survival, but I think it lent way too much on the arcadey side for it to ever be called a realistic medieval title. Yet there were some pretty cool ideas. There was a unique system called player sovereignty, which meant that players could become kings of regions and impose tax upon other people, these other people all having their own ranks and roles as well in this consistent, persistent world. A lot of the emphasis went on this player interaction, and this made for some of the best footage that kind of blew up the game in the first place, releasing on YouTube with huge YouTubers like Syndicate and Frankie on PC playing this title, some even calling it the best game ever made. It was kind of like Rust but medieval, and people adored it. With this robust crafting system, also building, having anything from small small huts up to bigger manors, and of course full castles that then could be sieged with full siege weaponry. It let players get on board with something that was new, and whilst Codehatch had done Starforge before, they weren't really as well known, so yes, it could have been a great red flag, but people weren't really aware of it. One of the biggest selling points was the combat and warfare. Once again, this was a medieval game. Being able to engage with enemies using things like axes, bows, swords, and other medieval weaponry, but most importantly, things like siege weapons, trebuchets, and battering rams to attack the enemy fortifications, meaning that people could spend ages building up these huge manors and castles just to then be broken down by an enemy clan that didn't really want you to be in their territory. And this is what made a really good game loop, having the difference between single people walking around and huge clans, making the difference between building a small farmstead to a huge city that everybody had their own roles. And this is where, of course, as mentioned, the sovereignty of kings and taxes and all that system came into play as well. Not just this, but other players could challenge the king's rule, leading to political intrigue and conflict within the game, being able to claim the throne room and becoming the king themselves, forming groups from mutual protection or resource sharing, or even for coordinated attack, capturing and imprisoning enemies. And yes, you could do that with voice over IP. It made for some incredibly fun moments. Not just this, but the voice chat also was within certain distances, and it meant that the louder you yelled, people could hear it from further and further away. And you might think this is a small addition, but it made just for some of the most funny moments. You see, some games live and die off these moments, and a title like Hold Fast Nations of War also experienced something very similar. The voice over IP and the voice chat proximity stuff made the best YouTube videos and funny moments clips, which blew the game up, and Reign of Kings was experiencing this. It was a really ambitious concept, but it had players' attention. So what went wrong? Why did it end up falling off a huge cliff and being tied to the stocks? Well, there are a lot of technical issues to start with. As you can see by much of this gameplay, whilst it is very ambitious and cool, it's still quite janky. There were numerous bugs and glitches with a lot of performance problems. The game suffered from rampant hacking and players using exploits, and just Codehatch were not putting anything in place in order to solve this. People were getting so angry at the developers because their game had become almost a cesspit, and this led into a more toxic fan base. Griefing and harassment was so common that just distracted from the overall experience. This meant that the reviews started to plummet over time. And for a game that was built off an entirely multiplayer community, it's not exactly advantageous when the fans that are sticking around start to hate each other. People just didn't feel like the developers were listening. They felt like everything that was being an issue was getting pushed to the side in order to, focus on content over quality, meaning that player count started to dwindle and issues persisted. New players were scarce, and the ones that did come in found a toxic fan base that wasn't very welcoming and accessible. Servers started to empty and become deserted, further diminishing the multiplayer experience. And then Codehatch, well, they handled Reign of Kings pretty much like they handled Starforge. They left it alone and didn't really try. There was community attempts at revival with private servers. Some dedicated players attempted to keep the game alive this way, but it wasn't enough. With limited modding tools in the game, the community just couldn't really get it back to where it needed to be. Now, later on, there was talks about other games like Moss, which was kind of a spin-off, a Rust medieval game. That seems to have died a sorry death. But we do have Renown, a game that now is starting to build on what Reign of Kings and what Rust have done in the past. It is still looking very hopeful, and the player base is still growing. So whilst Reign of Kings was a disaster that ended up failing, it might not be over for the medieval survival games just yet.
Okay, this was the one that I've been building up to this whole time. Let's have a deep dive back into Life is Feudal MMO, because it did die in one of the most horrific ways possible, yet somehow there's been more updates with it since its demise. Coming out in 2018 by Big Box Limited, Life is Feudal MMO was kind of the bigger version of a title called Life is Feudal Your Own that came out a few years before. It was a massively multiplayer online role-playing game that put you in possibly the most hardcore survival world of all time. One that really made you wonder why you even needed a job in the first place. The vision was supposed to be a large-scale, realistic medieval sandbox, building upon the foundations of its predecessor, the aforementioned Life is Feudal Your Own, which was this smaller-scale multiplayer title with 64 players on the server. Yet, the MMO version was supposed to be a persistent world with thousands of players, and, well, a map to fit it, providing historically grounded medieval experiences with survival mechanics, with a world entirely shaped by players' actions, where you could actually terraform, build tunnels, go into mines if you had 36 hours to take away one bit of rock, and of course, build complex crafting structures. Skill trees that reflected medieval professions and combat and took at least a century to unlock one square from, and massive siege warfare that inevitably nobody actually got to because cutting down a tree in order to build your palisade meant that you had to wait 4 weeks of real time for it to grow. Oh, can you tell that I'm not a huge fan of this game? Development began shortly after the Life is Feudal Your Own release back in 2015, with closed beta testing in 2016. Then it launched in 2017 with an open beta with an official release as mentioned in January of 2018. It was a huge title, and it actually did pretty well upon its initial release. Its business model adopted a buy-to-play with optional microtransactions for cosmetic items, and at the start they were okay. At the start. You see, the game had often utilized crowdfunding campaigns. This was all well and good, and there was a huge community for it. Mods like Mount and Blade's Persistent World was huge at the time, and people wanted a standalone version of it, and Life is Feudal's MMO seemed like the next best thing. But as these microtransactions started to leak in a little bit more, people started realizing, oh god, it gets worse and worse, with outrageous prices and completely surpassing all of the progression system. Being able to buy XP, being able to level up in incredibly fast times compared to the game itself. You see, it's nothing new and it's nothing special, people adding in microtransactions to MMOs in order to progress through the game quicker. But a game like Life is Feudal MMO slowed down the base game so much that, my god, it was almost paramount to pay extra money in order to have an not even enjoyable but passable experience. You see, players needed to manage hunger, health, stamina, and every other survival aspects. You'd have weather seasons that would affect gameplay, such as crop growth and travel conditions, and of course, things like the death penalty that would basically mean when you die, you lose all your skills. Yeah, it was pretty rough. But as mentioned, they really tried to focus so much on realism, so things like planting these crops would take days. Not in-game days, real-life days. Building mines would take hours and hours and hours in order to get to any sort of resources. I remember playing even just the Life is Feudal Your Own version. This was before they made it even grindier in the MMO, but my mates had to set up macro keys just so they wouldn't get RSI on their wrist for spending 30 minutes to take away one block in the mining department. Then the MMO came and ramped the ups to 11. There was some sort of combat and warfare with directional attacks and parries, similar to Mount and Blade, but because the servers were so laggy, not just because there was a lot of people on them, but also the infrastructure was just horrific, it was almost impossible. I mean, look at some of the gameplay from the battles. It's a cool idea to have thousands of players on the same map fighting it out, but my god, did it look absolutely awful. There were guilds and politics within it, where you could claim land to build settlements, but really, this was the only way to play. Because of the grindy system, it meant that you had to play in large groups. This meant that any stragglers would either get killed off or they would just leave the game because there was nothing to do for a 1 or 2 player clan. So everybody just became part of one big group. So there's no one else to fight. Okay, did they not think of this? There was a hierarchical system where guilds could become vassals and overlords, a little bit like Reign of Kings, but a lot more in depth. But as mentioned, most of the time on the server, you'd have 1 or 2 clans who would fight it out every couple weeks or so, and that was about it. Actual gameplay was so few and far between because of the actual time and commitment you had to put into it. It meant the only options were joining guilds and basically getting given stuff from other people. Because it was a player-driven economy, all the items were crafted by players, with trade being essential for acquiring resources, having its own currency system and trade posts, but this meant that as soon as the players started to drop, because of, well, most of the criticism I've given it already, the whole core system that was holding up the game and its player-driven economy really started to dwindle. The game's complexity made it so difficult for new players to get started without guidance, and I've said time and time again that accessibility is so important for building a fan base. Titles like Hell Let Loose have grown so well because they're really easy to get into, it's pretty straightforward, it's arcadey enough so you can have a lot of fun quite fast, but if you stick around and really get involved, you can join clans, you can play with communications and voice over IP in different roles, and you have all those options. Same with a game like Mount & Blade. You can jump into a multiplayer game and understand instantly this is a medieval siege, there's two sides, you could play with siege engines, firing catapults, or as a bowman or crossbowman. This is great. I want to delve in more, and then you start finding clans and the more hardcore aspects, or maybe even the persistent mods. But a title like Life is Feudal MMO did not have this. It was all or nothing. There was no putting your feet in the lukewarm waters of this medieval survival. It was, you've got to grind this game, use it as a second job, or you're not even going to find anything worth playing. Reviews and ratings were not very positive. In fact, it just wasn't really popular enough to hit the mainstream in that way. Players started to get a lot of concerns about the grindy nature of the game, and it became kind of that hardcore syndrome, where everybody within the game was so hardcore involved that no new players could have any fun or really wanted to be a part of it. So the game was shut down. But it wasn't quite over yet. You see, in January of 2021, Bitbox Limited announced that they were done. The termination of their agreement with the game's publishers, and, well, the servers were going off the rails. There was some community efforts for trying to revive it, but it didn't happen until it was bought up last year. Yeah. So the game is back. It's been bought by a Chinese company, and they're trying to sell it as a subscription model. No, it's not on Steam anymore, but you can get it through their website. And technically it's still going. They're still bringing out updates and they're trying to revive it in a big way. In fact, I was offered a sponsorship by it not that long ago, and I did have to turn it away because I just thought it was an absolutely terrible idea. I am still kind of on board with this game coming back and being a success, but so far, or at least until I see some tangible decisions that are made in order to make it more consumer friendly and actually fun for players, I'm not gonna touch this thing with a barge pole. Adding it as a subscription model is awful. I just wish that somebody would come and save this title, or actually just make a new one. But guys, can we actually make it fun? I don't need another job. I really don't. Please. But I'd love to know what you think. Which one do you think was the worst medieval disaster out of this list? And can you name any more that you wanted to be great but just didn't really cut the mustard? Let me know down in the comments below.